are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is the kidnapping of 8-year-old Jennifer Schuett. This is a survival story, and it's about a young girl who was in the safest place one could be. Yet, with one decision, one moment, everything would turn completely upside down. And, this is a survival story not like any other I have ever heard, and the pure bravery is unexplainable, and the intelligence is unfathomable, and it actually made a victim catch their own abductor. By the way, it's my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if it's something that you would like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed, give this video a thumbs up, and leave a nice comment down below. Now, I also want to thank our sponsor for today's video, which is NordPass, which is an online password manager. NordPass can help you stay safe online because it can recognize different suspicious websites that you might be going to put your information in, say your credit card or a password or something of the sorts, and it will actually tell you if it's a suspicious website or not, and if you should actually go through with whatever you were doing. Basically, it is a place where you can store every single one of your username and passwords for any website you can think of in one place, and you only need one master password to get into this. And when you're going onto these different websites, you'll have the NordPass extension, which will automatically add in different login information with one click. It's just an autofill. Something that we all really lack in doing is making sure that we're safe online as well, especially with the fact that we are all inside right now. We're doing most of our shopping online. That is why something like NordPass is so important. And NordPass is actually giving you guys 50% off. And this is at nordpass.com/Brooke, or you can use the coupon code of Brooke and you get 50% off, which is insane. This brings it to only $2.49 a month, $2.49 a month, and you get the first month free. I also do want to say that I know that I should be extremely grateful for the job that I have, that I'm still getting sponsorships, and I'm aware of my privilege during this time, and I am actually giving 50% of my earnings from the sponsorship to my local food bank, just to make sure that the children and the families who are either off of work or out of school right now are still being able to get food during this time, and it's something that's really important to me. I'm actually telling you guys this in hopes that if any of you are in a privileged situation, that you choose to, give your money or give your time to somebody in need. If you can't do anything, just spreading positivity is wonderful. Now, let's get back to the story. So it was 1990 in Texas, and the Schuett family lived in the small town of Dickinson. Now, Jennifer lived with her mother, Elaine, in a pretty small apartment, and Jennifer was an 8-year-old girl who had just finished 2nd grade. Now, she had a single mother, but it was a really good home life. They were best friends and loved each other dearly, and Jennifer actually really loved life in general. She loved school, she loved learning, anything she could do. She was just so positive about just any experience she could have, and she really didn't have a care in the world at this point. She was active, she loved swimming, she loved singing, and she was so adorable. She was known as just this really tiny ray of sunshine, basically, and she was also extremely curious and wanted to know everything about the world, why it worked, how it worked, and just wanted to know more than her little brain had to know at that time. She didn't take this simple answer either. She wanted explanations, and she wanted to go to the smartest people and find out different opinions, and this was from 8 years old. I mean, and probably even sooner than that. She was just that extremely intelligent type of little child. She seemed to be, to everyone who knew her, the type of girl who was going to change the world, because she thought differently than other people, and she didn't care that it made her different. She didn't care that some people didn't agree. that was what she wanted to do, was learn, and so she was going to do whatever she had to do so. And her biggest fear at the time, out of everything that she could have feared, was the dark. She, like a lot of little kids, didn't like it when the sun went down and it was time for bed. It was something that, she thought, monsters come out at night, and it just was an eerie time for her. So since her mother was a single mother, she let her sleep in her bed, and they pretty much slept together every single night because they just felt comfort in that. Jennifer knew that her mom was always a safe spot for her, and her mother did everything she could to make her feel that way. Her mother was a single mother working quite a few jobs at this time, but any free time she had, Elaine was at home with Jennifer. The only people to ever babysit her was Elaine's parents or her grandparents. This was really a mother who put her child first. Jennifer was her number one priority always, no matter what, and they like to say that they only had each other. You see, Jennifer's father had been in and out of prison her whole life, and she never really had a relationship with him, so it was just Elaine and Jennifer for her entire life. That's all she knew. So that's exactly what they were doing on the night of August 9th. They were both sleeping in this big bed in Elaine's room, and however, this night, Elaine had to get up early the next morning for work, and Jennifer wouldn't stop moving. She was restless. She was kind of kicking about, moving all over the bed, and finally Elaine said, "Look, you need to calm down. I have to go to work in the morning." And then eventually she said, "Can you please just maybe go try to sleep in your own bed tonight, because I cannot sleep with you moving?" And Jennifer, her little 8-year-old self, said, "Yes, Mommy, I will do that because I love you." And so she headed to her own bedroom around 2:30 a.m. and then they had a pretty good night's sleep after that. Well, at least her mother did. And this would lead to an enormous amount of guilt on Elaine's part in the days to come, but in that moment she couldn't have known what would occur next. You see, the next morning when Elaine woke up and went to wake up Jennifer, she was not in her bedroom, and in fact she was nowhere in the house, and her mother immediately called 911 because the window in her bedroom was open, and this was something that was completely unusual, and she knew Jennifer wouldn't have done it herself. And so they immediately got on the case, and they got to this apartment, and they were calling it a possible abduction from the very beginning, which is, a wonderful thing considering a lot of children are said to be runaways at first, as we all know. But the downside of this was that the Dickinson Police Department was very small at this time. In fact, there were like 3 officers and 1 detective for the entire department taking care of this entire town. So they had to team up with different police departments in the area, as well as volunteers and the FBI, for this search for this little girl. Jennifer's mother was completely distraught and of course heartbroken, and she said that night she hadn't woken up after Jennifer went to her own bedroom. She heard no break-in, no screams, nothing, and she said that the apartment was actually on the first floor and the windows led out to the parking lot, so she feared that someone had found her from there. This apartment was the best that Elaine could do for her and her daughter. She, like I said, gave everything to her daughter, and it was a decent apartment. However, with a mother who is single and working multiple jobs, it's not going to be the best apartment in the best area, of course. And so Jennifer's grandparents had actually started worrying about them living there, and they decided that they were going to help purchase them a home. Now, this was a home that was nearby their own house, and it was on a cul-de-sac, and it was in foreclosure, so they got it a little cheaper. So they bought this, and they were going to help fix it up for Jennifer and Elaine, and they were actually going to be moving into this house a few months after this. And in fact, earlier that day of the abduction, that is where they were, working on the house. They were actually working in the garden, which had a whole bunch of trees and a forest nearby. And this is how Jennifer got a whole bunch of mosquito bites. And this is why she was itching and restless all night long. Elaine said that all she had was Jennifer, nothing else, and she needed her back. And that's what everybody was trying to do. They were working really hard, and they were going from apartment building to apartment building, asking people if they had seen or heard anything that night. But it was in the middle of the night, and people said, no, I was asleep at that time. I have no idea what happened. I didn't see anything. And so they went back to Jennifer and Elaine's apartment. They searched the room for different fingerprints, and they also looked for surveillance cameras at the apartments or in the area, but there weren't any nearby. Thankfully, the distraught Elaine would not have to wait long to locate her daughter. Nearly a full 24 hours later, that evening of the search, they would head out to fields nearby Dickinson, and this was as the sun went down. At 6:30 p.m., the police had been called to this area by some kids who had said they had been in this field playing around when they had tripped over something and immediately realized that it was a body. They ran home to their parents, and their parents called the police, and they quickly found, when police arrived, that it was the body of a little girl. They quickly found that it was Jennifer Schuett, and she was lying in the grass 3.5 miles from her home, and in some sort of miracle, she was still breathing. Although at this point she was going in and out of consciousness, and they actually had to life flight her in a helicopter to the nearest hospital where she could be treated for her injuries, and no one believed at this point that she would make it, and investigators started putting together a murder investigation because they believed that that is what it was going to be. Doctors quickly found that she was in a horrible condition. Her throat had actually been cut from ear to ear, and she was very pale. Her body was covered in bites, and there were scratches all over her as well. Her eyes were also filled with blood due to being strangled. They also feared that she had been violently sexually assaulted, and by this time, thankfully, she was alert and she could look at the doctors, but she couldn't speak to them because of the cut on her throat. And so they could just look at her, looking back at them, and she was so afraid and she couldn't even say anything. They tried to comfort her, tell her she was in a safe place now, but the one person that could make her feel that way, her mother, couldn't be there at this time due to her condition, and she would instantly be rushed into surgery by Dr. Strunk, and he would do his best to fix her up and hopefully keep her alive. And thankfully, she would come out of that surgery much better, and the abductor and this attacker was thought to miss all major blood vessels, meaning that now she was much more stable, she was no longer bleeding, and they would put her in a hospital room surrounded by police officers who were making sure that she was still safe and making sure that this attacker wouldn't come back upon finding that the victim wasn't dead. There was also a pediatric ICU nurse named Sharon McBride who stayed by her side the entire time, refusing to leave because Sharon had an 8-year-old daughter herself and just imagined her own daughter as Jennifer. And so the entire time, even when Jennifer's mother was allowed in the room, she didn't leave. Eventually, her mother was allowed to see Jennifer, but this even then wasn't going to be an easy recovery because, you see, Jennifer was suddenly terrified of all males, doctors, police officers, anyone, and she actually kicked one doctor in the stomach when he got near her. And she was so scared that they ended up not letting any males in the room at all. They tried to tell her, that doctors and nurses and officers were the good guys and that they were there to help her, that they could be trusted, but Jennifer didn't believe them and they didn't yet understand why. That's when investigators needed to hear what happened to this 8-year-old, and to have her live or relive this traumatic experience wouldn't be an easy thing for anyone involved, but they knew that they wanted to catch who had done this to this sweet soul. This brave girl would then begin to tell her story, and she said that when her mother asked her to go to her own bedroom, she did, and she went down the hall and she turned on this light in her bedroom, and it was so big it was shaped like a giant light bulb, and it lit up the entire room, and it made her feel more safe that the light was on. And so then she went over, she grabbed some books as well as some coins from her piggy bank so she could read, count the coins, and hopefully distract herself enough to fall asleep. which is what happened. She fell asleep and she didn't even, plan to. It's not something that she really knew was happening, but she did doze off. And the next thing she knew, she was in the arms of a man she didn't know. She thought it had to be a dream at first because she wasn't in her bedroom. She wasn't in her mom's bedroom. She wasn't in the apartment at all. This man holding her was running down the sidewalk. And as soon as she opened her mouth to scream, he covered it with his hand. They got into a car and Jennifer was placed on his lap as he drove away, and he was telling her that everything was okay, that he was a police officer. Jennifer said that even in this groggy state that she had a feeling in her gut that something wasn't right, and she actually looked back and she saw that her mother's car was still in the parking lot, so she didn't know why she was being taken away from her. As they drove further, she realized that she was probably being kidnapped, and she had no idea what was going to happen next. She had just learned in school about stranger danger, but she had also learned that police officers were good guys, so she was so confused at which one this man was. Investigators could now understand why she didn't like the male police officers, but they didn't yet know why she didn't like the male doctors. But she explained to them that she couldn't trust anyone if this police officer was lying to her and wasn't actually a police officer. She didn't know who was telling the truth. That's when they were driving, and Jennifer saw that they were passing by her grandparents' house, and she told this man, "I can just be dropped off at my grandparents' house." And he said, "No, you can't, they're not home." But she knew that he was lying at this point because their cars were in the driveway. At this point, Jennifer was terrified, knowing that she was in a really bad situation and there was nothing she could do, and she actually wet herself as they drove. And that is when they pulled into the local elementary school and just parked. And this man told Jennifer to look up at the moon and that her mother would be there to pick her up when the moon changed color, so when it was daytime again. And so she did, and this man was drinking a beer, but her mother would never come. And eventually the man said, "Well, your mother didn't show up, so we're gonna have to leave." And he started driving away. He offered her candy and she refused to take it, knowing that this was not something you should take from a stranger. And they drove a few blocks away to a dead-end road that was gravel. And they pulled up to this overgrown field, and when they stopped, Jennifer actually asked the man, "If you're an officer, where's your gun and badge?" Because she had remembered from everything they'd learned at school that an officer always had those things. And he said that he at first didn't have them with him, and then he said they're actually in the back seat. So she stood up to look over into the back seat, and that's when he would pull her underwear down and begin to lick her. And she would also have a knife to her throat at this point, and this man was saying, "Am I scaring you, little girl? Am I scaring you?" And she didn't even have time to respond before she was being choked over and over again. This was as hard as this man could, and then he tried to break her neck. And that was the last thing she knew was happening before she blacked out. When she woke up, she was being dragged naked by her ankles through this field. She could feel the sticks and the rocks on her back, but she decided to stay silent and play dead. It was dark, so the man really couldn't see her anyways, and her legs were then tossed to the ground, and she just stayed there, still as could be. Then she heard the footsteps of the man walking away. The car door slammed shut, and she realized the man had left her for dead. But she was still alive, and she tried to scream but couldn't figure out why she couldn't. That is when she reached up and felt her neck, and it was covered in blood. This whole story was told by Jennifer with notes. She still couldn't speak, and so she was jotting down little notes or little answers to questions that she was being asked, and she was so frustrated because she couldn't say what she wanted to say in the way she wanted to say it, and she had so many details that she had to get out, and the officers were males, and so they were actually standing outside, and her mother was asking her the questions and then handing the papers to them, so it made it really difficult. But the thing that made it easy was Jennifer, because she knew so much more than they thought she ever could. Because she did tell them something very important, that this man had said his name was Dennis. Now, she went into detail about, the agonizing time period where she just laid in the grass before they found her. She said she could feel that the ants were biting her and they were actually keeping her awake, and the sun was coming up. She could hear children playing next to her, and there was actually a dog that kept coming up and licking her and running away and coming back as though it was trying to get its owner's attention, but unfortunately no one else came. She said she was drifting in and out of consciousness, and every time she woke up, she was so surprised that she hadn't died yet. She looked to the side and she could see cars in the distance, but she couldn't yell out to them, and she said at this point she didn't really fear what was happening to her. She was almost at peace with dying. An 8-year-old girl at peace with dying. And that is when she would wake again to the sound of children playing closer to where she was laying, and then something hit her foot. And that is when they found her. She drifted out of consciousness again, and when she came back to, she saw an officer kneeling down beside her saying, "You've been found and you're going to be okay. Just please stay with me. Please stay with me." Jennifer's uncle actually brought her some different, toys while she was in the hospital healing, and one of those was a Tinkerbell makeup set. And when she opened it, there was a mirror inside, and this was actually the first time she had seen herself since all of this happened. And she said she felt hideous and completely unrecognizable, and it just wasn't her. But she was a fighter, and she had just won this battle, and so for her to even think that she should look a certain way is so sad. But also at the same time, this little girl shouldn't have had to look in the mirror and see that she didn't even look like herself. Jennifer told investigators that she was wearing a pink t-shirt to bed as well as white underwear covered in blue roses, and this would be the hardest part of it all because she would have to describe her abductor. And she would say that she remembered he was a white male in his 30s who wore glasses and had a black mustache with 1 or 2 green tattoos. She said he looked greasy, he had a scar or something on his face, and Jennifer then said that he also had cigarettes and beer in his car, and she could even remember the brand that they were, as well as the car that she rode in and the fact that there was a dent on the side. At 8 years old, she was trying to remember everything she could to catch this abductor, and a female sketch artist was brought in to help her more in depth figure out what this man looked like. And without talking, Jennifer was able to provide such an in-depth sketch that was insanely detailed. And when the sketch artist finished, she turned it around to Jennifer, and Jennifer nodded her head. Yes, that was the man. And so they sent this out to the public in hopes that someone would recognize him. And Sharon, the ICU nurse with the daughter that was the same age who refused to leave the room and leave Jennifer, actually had to step out after hearing the story that Jennifer was telling because she needed to cry, and she refused to let Jennifer, who was such a brave girl, see her cry because she wanted to be strong for her, because Jennifer was so insanely strong herself. They didn't have any leads yet as far as suspects, but they would canvass the area near the crime scene and find that about a quarter mile away in a ditch would be clothing. The same clothing that Jennifer described wearing, as well as cut up men's underwear and a t-shirt that it was wrapped up in as though they were one. And they hoped that this would point to a possible suspect in the future, but they just needed to match it to someone at this point. At this point in the hospital, Jennifer was actually getting really frustrated just with a lot of things. Healing and trauma is not an easy thing to deal with ever. And so she was getting frustrated because she couldn't have a certain chocolate bar, and she actually yelled out, and a tiny squeak came out that shocked everyone because her vocal cord was basically cut in half. Or her vocal box was cut in half, so they didn't figure she would ever get her voice back. And the next morning, she actually woke up with her voice once again, and this was some sort of miracle. Eventually, Jennifer did heal enough to be discharged from the hospital and to go home, and she was so terrified because this was thought to be her safe haven, and she hadn't left since the abduction. She would actually be able to attend school that next year, and she was with all of her classmates again. But things would change in school because police officers would be in the schools, in the classrooms, because all of the parents were so terrified to even let their kids go to school because of what had happened to Jennifer. Jennifer struggled to be home alone even as she got into her teenage years, and she still feared men, and anytime she approached any sort of man, she wondered if he was a threat to her. As Jennifer grew up, the case got colder and colder, and no one forgot what happened, no matter how much they wanted to. And Jennifer actually graduated high school, then college, and went on to be a librarian for children, and she absolutely loved this. She also met a man who comforted her and who made her feel safe. His name was Jonathan, and for the first time in a long time, she trusted a man, and they fell in love. Jennifer leaned on him a lot as her case was transferred from officer to officer who wasn't really doing anything. The case wasn't moving at all. There was such little progress being made, and her family actually couldn't talk to her about it because they had lived through such a traumatic event of missing their daughter and then finding her in such a horrific state, and so they didn't want to relive it. But to Jennifer, she did, because she wanted to be able to recount every little detail for when they caught this man, or to help in catching this man, so she couldn't forget. She refused to. So she never forgot a thing about that night, and she couldn't block it out, no matter how much it would have helped. In fact, she often visited the field that she was found in. Jennifer then started to become a victim's advocate and use her voice to help the victims who lost their lives or just like her had survived something horrific. And she was very open about everything that she had gone through, telling her story. And she often jokes that, when she got her voice back in the hospital, she hasn't shut up since. Suddenly, it was 2008, 18 years after this had happened, and Jennifer would get a call from a detective who is now on her case, a new detective, and he was, from right off the bat, seeming like he was going to do much more than anyone else. And he called Jennifer in for a meeting, which is something she hadn't had in years, and she ended up crying to him, saying that she just wanted this man caught, and this officer said he was going to do everything in his power to catch this guy, no matter what. He would work on this case till the end of his career, and he actually invited an FBI special agent in to help them with this case as well. And they would actually go on to look at the previously collected evidence of the clothing to send it in for DNA testing, which had yet to be done. And thankfully it took a year, but that September 22nd, the DNA would provide a match to a man named Dennis Earl Bradford. That's right, a man with the same name that Jennifer had given 19 years prior, Dennis. So who was Dennis Bradford? Well, at that point he was a 39-year-old man living in Arkansas and had just been released from prison after spending 4 years of a 12-year sentence. And what was this sentence for? Well, he had been convicted in Hot Springs, Arkansas in 1997 for a kidnapping, 7 years after Jennifer's abduction. He had tried to choke her and hold a knife to her throat, just like in Jennifer's case, and it was found that 6 months after Jennifer's case, he had actually been found to sexually assault a woman he had met at bars at a local post office. And this caused his DNA to be put into the database, which is how they provided a match to Jennifer's case. Now, just to be sure this was the man, they sent out a request to get his driver's license photo from around the time of Jennifer's case, and they just wanted to see what he would look like. And when they got it back, they were baffled because this looked identical to the sketch that Jennifer had helped create. She was spot on about everything, even at 8 years old. It was also found that Dennis had 2 different addresses in Dickinson around the time of this abduction, and they were both close to Jennifer's apartment. So on October 19th of 2009, Dennis would be pulled over at a traffic stop where he was in the car with his wife, and he would be arrested on a warrant. They questioned him and they said that Dennis looked like the guy next door. He had a wife, he had 3 adult stepsons, he was a welder who was doing well financially, and when they asked him if he knew the name Jennifer Schuett, he said yes. They asked him how, and he said that he was around the area of Dickinson around that time. He saw the billboards and he prayed for her. He was then told that Jennifer survived, and he allegedly cried, saying, "She's alive? I was hoping she'd make it." Then when he was asked if he ever came in contact with her, he said yes, but then refused to tell them how. He then said that they had done their homework. And at this point, Dennis's demeanor was said to be very cold, and he was refusing to talk. But eventually, he did. He broke. And he said, "Not a single day goes by where I don't see that baby. There is no other side to the story. She was an innocent, and I was a sick, deranged, beat-up little effing punk. She wasn't anybody I knew. I don't remember why I pulled up to those apartments. I walked over to this window, and I remember it was open, and I could see in it, and the light was on." He refused to go into it, and when investigators told him that they wanted to hear the whole story so that Jennifer could have justice, that's when he finally spoke even more about that night. And he said, "I'm ready for this to be over. I'm sick and tired of looking over my shoulder and being afraid. Forgive me, Mama. I pulled that little girl out of the window and I put her in my car. She was freaking out and I told her, please don't worry. I told her I was a police officer and that everything would be all right. Then I just lost it. I was like a savage animal. I can't force myself to say it. I took that little girl out there and I raped her and cut her throat. I don't know why. I've never known why. Many times I've just wanted to end it, but I never had the guts." After 4 hours, they had a confession, and he even said he'd used his mother's car to do all this. And his mother's car matched what Jennifer described. It was also found that Dennis had attempted suicide shortly after Jennifer was found, and he couldn't do it, so he was taken to a psychiatric ward that was in the same hospital that Jennifer herself was healing in at this time. At the press conference when they announced that her attacker and abductor had been caught, Jennifer took the stand and she said, "I'm not a victim, but instead victorious." But she said that she couldn't wait to come face to face with him in court. Now, the trial was actually set for August 10th, and Dennis was said to be pleading guilty. He just wanted to get it all over with, and that made Jennifer extremely happy. She was ready to put this all behind her. However, that May 10th, a few months before the trial, Dennis was found in his cell where he had hung himself. Jennifer screamed over the phone as she was informed about this because the one thing she asked them to do was make sure he didn't kill himself before the trial. As the months went by after that, it was then August 10th, which was supposed to be the day of the trial, and Jennifer had a victim's impact statement that she had written, so she decided to take it to Dennis's grave and read it to him. And it said, "Dennis Bradford, I waited 19 years, 2 months, and 3 days to find out your last name and for you to be caught. You chose the wrong little 45-pound 8-year-old girl to try and murder because for 19 years I thought of you every single day and helped in searching for you. In my heart, I knew you were out there, alive, either in prison or living a lie. And now I know, listening to my heart all these years and never giving up on finding you, I was right." Now, she actually turned to her husband at this point and she asked him, "Do you think Dennis can hear me?" And at that very moment, she was bit by an ant, a fire ant, just like the ones that she had been covered in that day on the field. And she said that she believes that that is a sign that Dennis was listening, that he had to hear her say all that. Now, unfortunately, because of the violent sexual assault that Jennifer had gone through, she was told it was going to be very hard for her to conceive children. And she had actually gone on the Today Show at one point to tell her story, and she, told this part of it. And that is when a doctor came forward and said that he would actually do IVF to help her get pregnant, and he would actually pay for it as well. And 2 years later, they had their first daughter named Jenna, and then their son. Her attacker tried to take her voice as well as her right to be a mother, but he didn't succeed. Jennifer wants her story to be heard, but not for her, for other people who have dealt with horrific events in their life and have to continue living day to day. She said, "We all have experienced something in our lifetime that we can use our voice to share with another individual to give them a sense of hope. I hope you are inspired to use your voice to help someone else." I just think that this case is beautiful in so many ways. It's horrific, but beyond that, it's beautiful how Jennifer dealt with it, who she was, and that she caught her abductor. She did that, and she's so incredibly strong. I think she deserves to have her story told to millions, but I can tell her story to as many of you who want to listen, and I'm grateful for that. Don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay? Bye.